Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into a different world. The world of the Vikings, but not as fierce warriors. Instead, we're going to explore how they rested and recharged. Imagine a place where the air is crisp, the skies are often overcast, and the days are short. The Vikings didn't have the luxury of modern comforts or technology, but they had their ways of unwinding, finding peace, and preparing for the next challenge in their demanding lives. They found rest, not in soft beds or luxuries, but in the rhythms of nature, the warmth of the hearth, and the closeness of their community. It might surprise you how much of their rest was entwined with their survival, and how it played a crucial role in their ability to thrive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're watching from, whether you're in the northern latitudes or somewhere warm. It's fascinating how much these environments can shape a person's way of life. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now that we're settled in, let's set the stage. The Vikings, infamous for their raids and their incredible seafaring abilities, lived in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. They were born in Scandinavia, where the winters were harsh, the seas unpredictable, and the land often unforgiving. But the Viking approach to life wasn't just about survival, it was about thriving in the face of adversity, and rest, in its many forms, was a key part of their approach. The Vikings were warriors, yes, but they were also farmers, traders, and craftsmen. They needed to be strong physically, mentally, and spiritually. And just like us, they understood the importance of rest, whether it was a brief moment of relaxation after a hard day of work, a longer nap during the long Nordic nights, or spiritual rejuvenation that came from connecting with the divine or nature. But for the Vikings, rest wasn't just a passive activity. It was a part of their rhythm of life, strategically woven into their routines to ensure that they could stay sharp, focused, and ready for anything. Let's start with the daily rhythms. Viking life was shaped by the sun and the seasons. The harsh northern winters meant that the Vikings were forced to adapt to shorter days and colder nights. This, in turn, had a profound impact on how they rested. Unlike our modern lives, where we have the luxury of artificial light and climate control, the Vikings had no choice but to live in harmony with the natural world. Their sleep patterns were governed by the seasons, with longer periods of rest during the cold, dark winters, and a more frenetic pace of activity during the brief summer months when daylight was plentiful. But during the winter, when the days were short and the cold pressed in, the Vikings turned to their homes for warmth and rest. The longhouse was the central hub of Viking life, providing shelter, warmth, and a place for families to bond. It wasn't just a physical space. It was a space for mental and emotional rest as well. Picture yourself in one of these with the fire crackling in the center, the scent of roasting meat filling the air, and the soft murmur of conversation and laughter. After a day of hard work, whether it was farming, building ships, or preparing for a raid, the longhouse was a sanctuary for the Vikings. This was a place where they could unwind, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. In these moments, the Vikings didn't just rest their bodies. They gathered with their families and friends, told stories, and shared experiences. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment. It was a way to connect with one another, to process the events of the day, and to pass on knowledge and wisdom to younger generations. For the Vikings, rest was not just about sleeping. It was about connecting, reflecting, and recharging the spirit. This communal rest was vital to maintaining a strong social structure, something that was critical in their harsh and often volatile world. In fact, resting through storytelling was one of the more fascinating aspects of Viking culture. Their skalds, the poets, and bards played a vital role in this process. The stories they told weren't just tales of faraway lands and heroic deeds. They also included lessons on how to live, how to face adversity, and how to cope with the struggles of daily life. These stories provided both mental rest and emotional relief. The communal aspect of storytelling also allowed the Vikings to share a sense of belonging and purpose, creating bonds that were vital to their survival. As we continue to explore this Viking world of rest, it's clear that their approach was about more than just sleep. Vikings used their rest to prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. Whether it was a raid, the coming winter, or a hard season of farming. In a world that demanded so much physical and mental exertion, taking time to rest and recharge wasn't just necessary, it was strategic. This approach to rest also had a spiritual component. The Vikings believed that their fate was intertwined with the will of the gods. Before battles, they would take time to offer sacrifices and prayers to Odin, Thor, and the other gods. These rituals weren't just about seeking favor. They were about mentally preparing themselves for the challenges ahead. For the Vikings, spiritual rest was as important as physical rest. They knew that the battle for survival was not just fought with weapons, but with the mind and spirit as well. By taking the time to connect with the divine, they could find inner peace and strength before facing the chaos of battle or the harsh conditions of winter. As we reflect on the Vikings' world, it becomes clear that rest was an essential part of their survival strategy. In a life that was defined by constant struggle, whether it was battling enemies or facing the challenges of the environment, rest was not something to be taken lightly. It was a means of staying sharp, staying connected, and staying grounded. Without it, the Vikings wouldn't have been able to maintain the mental clarity, physical strength, and resilience needed to thrive in such a demanding world. The Vikings knew that rest was not a luxury, but a necessity, and their approach to rest was both practical and deeply integrated into their spiritual, emotional, and social lives. Rest wasn't just about getting sleep, it was about preparing for the next challenge. Whether that challenge was a raid, a long winter, or the ongoing battle of survival. In our own busy lives, it's easy to forget the importance of rest. We live in a world that values productivity and constant motion. But the Vikings' approach to rest reminds us that taking time to pause, reflect, and recharge is not just beneficially essential. Without rest, we lose our clarity, our focus, and our sense of purpose. Like the Vikings, we need to find balance in our lives. We need moments of quiet and reflection, times to connect with others, and times to recharge our bodies and minds. As we explore the rhythms of Viking life, it's clear that rest was not just a passive activity. It was a deliberate, strategic part of their way of life. It helped them face the challenges of their world with strength and resilience. And it's a lesson we can all learn from today. As the first rays of light crept across the Nordic landscape, the world around you slowly began to stir. But in Viking lands, the morning light wasn't as quick to show itself as it is in the warmer regions of the world. The sun rose late in the winter, often lingering in the sky for just a few brief hours before dipping back below the horizon, giving the day a feeling of quiet urgency. Yet, it wasn't the rush of daylight that defined the Viking morning, but rather the slow, almost ritualistic way in which Vikings began their day. Vikings, living in the cold, vast expanses of Scandinavia, experienced a kind of time that didn't rush them. The mornings, especially in the winter months, were more about preparation and patience than urgency. With the chill still in the air, the Viking day often began not with the sharp sound of a bell or a loud call to action, but with the slow, deliberate rituals that marked the start of their day. Picture yourself in one of those early mornings. The sky is still grey, barely hinting at the sunrise. You're waking up in a warm longhouse, the hearth still alive with the last embers of the night's fire. The scent of burning wood lingers, and as you stretch and rise from your furs, you hear the faint sounds of soft murmurs from those around you. This is a Viking morning, quiet, intimate, and purposeful. The first task of the day for most Vikings was simple but essential: stoking the fire. Fire was not just a luxury, but a lifeline. It provided warmth, light, and a means to cook food. As the family gathered around the hearth, there was a shared sense of responsibility to keep the fire alive, just as there was a shared sense of responsibility for each other. This was a quiet moment of bonding, as everyone began to wake and prepare for the day ahead. As you adjust to the warmth of the fire, you might also notice the sound of birds outside, the rustling of the wind in the trees, or the occasional whisper of a distant animal. The Viking morning wasn't defined by the harshness of the outside world. It was shaped by a much more gradual rhythm, allowing time for thoughts to settle, for plans to be made, and for the body to wake gently from the slumber of the previous night. Now, it's important to understand that Viking mornings weren't the same for everyone. In a longhouse, there might be multiple families sharing a space. Some would rise early, while others would linger in bed a little longer, reluctant to leave. The warmth of the fire, the quiet conversations that began to fill the air would be punctuated by the sounds of movement, shuffling feet, the clink of iron tools, and the occasional laughter of children. All of these noises were reminders that Viking life was not just about the grand moments of battle or conquest, but also about the soft and mundane moments that made up the fabric of their days. As the fire grows brighter, and you stretch a little more, you might begin to hear the sounds of the animals being fed. In the Viking homestead, animals weren't just part of the economy, they were part of the daily rhythm. The sounds of hooves on the ground, the bleating of sheep, or the clucking of chickens punctuated the Viking morning routine. Feeding the animals was a way to connect with the earth and maintain a sense of continuity in a world that could be unpredictable and dangerous. But the Viking morning wasn't just about keeping the fire alive and feeding the animals. It was also a time for the body to ease into the day. There were no alarms blaring to rush you out of bed. Instead, the natural light that filtered through the wooden walls would encourage you to rise and begin the day at your own pace. While the sun might not rise early, the day was still marked by certain activities, taking the time to gather your thoughts, preparing your weapons if necessary, or helping with household chores. Viking life was a constant balancing act between survival and comfort, work and rest. The mornings were no different. As the first meal of the day approached, there was a quiet calm to the house, a sense that the rush of the outside world had not yet come crashing in. It was a time to reflect on the day ahead, to prepare yourself mentally and physically for whatever challenges lay ahead. Historians still argue about how much of Viking society was shaped by necessity versus a desire for routine and comfort. Some believe that the need to prepare for raids and survival shaped every aspect of Viking life, including their approach to rest and leisure. Others argue that the Vikings, despite their warrior culture, understood the importance of balance, of taking the time to recover and connect with those around them. One quirky tidbit to consider is that the Vikings often used what we might call a natural alarm clock to wake them up. No snooze buttons here. The rising sun, the sound of the wind, or even the animals outside would act as their cue to start the day. But there were also other signs, like the smells of breakfast beginning to fill the air, that signaled the start of daily activities. The Vikings didn't need a buzzer or loud noises to get up. They had nature and the rhythms of their surroundings to guide them now. Let's think for a moment about the importance of light. With the harsh Nordic winters and short daylight hours, the Vikings would have made the most of the precious hours of sunlight they received. The early morning hours were a quiet reminder of the transient nature of daylight, and they took full advantage of the time they had. As the sun began to rise higher in the sky, it brought warmth not just physically, but emotionally. The quiet hours of the morning allowed the Vikings to prepare for the hard work ahead without the immediate pressure of the day's demands. Despite the urgency of Viking culture built on raids, travel, and conquest, the mornings were decidedly slow and peaceful. The idea that Vikings lived in a constant state of battle frenzy is more myth than reality. While they were formidable warriors, they also understood the importance of daily life and the quiet rhythms that sustained them. This balance between rest and action, between peace and war, was crucial for their survival. And the mornings, with their gentle pace and shared responsibilities, were the perfect setting for Viking rest to begin. The work didn't stop just because the sun rose. There were animals to care for, fire to tend, and meals to prepare. But within that work, there was rest. A shared peace that allowed the Vikings to face the demands of their day without burning themselves out. The morning was more than just a physical awakening. It was a mental one as well. It set the tone for the day and reminded the Vikings of the connection between their personal well-being, the health of their community, and their relationship with nature. Rest wasn't just about sleep, it was about connecting with the land, with each other, and with the cycles of life that governed their world. As you drift deeper into the Viking world, imagine yourself stepping into the warmth of the longhouse, the beating heart of Viking life. These homes were simple yet functional, providing both shelter from the harsh elements and a space for rest, relaxation, and rejuvenation. The longhouse wasn't just a structure. It was a place where Viking families gathered, ate, slept, and spent their quiet moments in between battles or travels. It was, for all intents and purposes, a sanctuary, and every detail of its design was crafted with the idea of comfort in mind, comfort by Viking standards. Of course, the longhouse itself was a marvel of Viking ingenuity. Made primarily from wood, with a thatched roof or sod covering to protect against the rain, the longhouse was often a communal dwelling. Larger longhouses could house multiple families, while smaller versions were typically home to just one household. The central feature of the longhouse was the hearth, which provided heat and light to the entire building. The hearth was not just a fire for cooking, it was the heart of the home, drawing everyone in as they went about their daily tasks. Inside, the longhouse was surprisingly cozy. The warmth of the fire, the smells of cooked meals wafting through the air, and the flicker of candlelight created an atmosphere of peace and security. But while Viking longhouses were often dark and smoky due to the lack of chimneys, they were also incredibly practical. The design was functional, made to withstand the cold, and to serve the needs of the family, both in terms of rest and daily chores. Despite the smoke, which could be stifling, The interior was a place where the Viking family could take refuge, rest, and gather their strength for the days ahead. In the quiet of the longhouse, you might find yourself resting on the simple bedding made of furs and wool. These weren't the softest of beds, but they were certainly effective at keeping warmth. The furs and blankets served to insulate the body against the cold that would otherwise creep in during the long, harsh winters. There were no pillows, as we know them today, but instead, Viking families would use cloth bundles filled with straw or wool for some semblance of comfort. These rustic sleeping arrangements were far from luxurious, but they worked well for the Viking lifestyle. Practical, efficient, and always attuned to the needs of the body. While the Viking longhouse was primarily a shelter, it also served as a place for rest, relaxation, and connection. In many ways, it was the perfect antidote to the harsh world outside. Life in Viking times was challenging, with the constant threat of raids, the cold, and the scarcity of resources. But within the walls of the longhouse, there was a sense of calm that was hard to find anywhere else. This was where the family could bond over meals, share stories, and connect with one another after a long day of hard work. At the center of this peaceful coexistence was the hearth. As the fire crackled and the warmth enveloped the room, you could imagine yourself sitting with your family, surrounded by the comforting glow of the flames. The hearth wasn't just a source of light and heat, it was also a source of community. Meals were prepared here, and stories were told around it. It was the gathering place of the Viking family, where everyone came together to rest, recover, and recharge. In the evenings, after a long day of hard work, the Viking family would sit together in the longhouse, often around the hearth, eating their meals and resting. The evening meal was often simple, consisting of fish, meat, and vegetables, basic but nourishing fare. This wasn't a time for grand feasts, but rather for sustenance, warmth, and connection. The Vikings didn't need elaborate dining rooms or fancy dishes. They valued function over form, and their mealtimes were just another opportunity to rest, reflect, and bond. Of course, the idea of rest in the Viking world was far different from the idea of rest that we have today. While we tend to think of rest as something that involves lying down and taking a break from work, Viking rest was more integrated into their daily life. Rest wasn't just about sleep, it was about balance. Resting during the day, whether it was taking a short nap or simply sitting by the fire, was just as important as sleep during the night. This rhythm of work and rest was what kept the Vikings going, both physically and mentally. Interestingly, historians still argue about whether Viking society truly understood the importance of rest and relaxation, or whether they were more focused on survival and conquest. Some historians suggest that rest was more of an afterthought for the Vikings, something that happened when they were not actively engaged in battle or exploration. Others argue that the Vikings, despite their warrior culture, understood the value of rest and found ways to weave it into their daily lives. Regardless of the debate, one thing is clear: the Vikings found comfort and rest in their longhouses, and these simple structures provided the necessary respite to recharge for the next day's challenges. The design of the longhouse was not only practical but also deeply connected to the Viking worldview. Vikings saw themselves as part of the natural world, and their homes reflected this connection. The materials used to build the longhouses, wood, straw, and stone, were all sourced from the land around them. This connection to nature wasn't just about survival. It was also about understanding the rhythms of the earth and living in harmony with them. The longhouse was a space that respected the natural world and its cycles, creating a sanctuary where Vikings could rest, reflect, and reconnect with themselves and their families. The quiet moments spent inside the longhouse, by the hearth or lying on furs, were a way for the Vikings to restore their energy, to reflect on their day, and to prepare for the next one. The longhouse provided a space where the Vikings could unwind, where the pace of the world outside slowed, and where the demands of survival could be momentarily forgotten. Within these humble walls, the Vikings found their rest, a vital part of their daily routine that allowed them to continue facing the challenges of their harsh world. Rest, then, in the Viking world, was not an indulgence or luxury, it was a necessity. It was a time to pause, reflect, and renew the body and spirit. The longhouse was a sanctuary, offering the Vikings the peace they needed to keep going. In a world that demanded constant vigilance, the longhouse offered a brief respite, a moment to rest, recharge, and connect with those who mattered most. Now, let's talk about leisure, but don't go thinking this is all about lounging on soft couches, sipping hot cocoa. Viking leisure was functional and often intertwined with their warrior spirit. Even though their lives were dominated by the constant pressure of surviving in a harsh, unpredictable world, Vikings understood the importance of rest and relaxation, especially before heading off to another raid or battle. But, unlike what you might imagine, they didn't need to be constantly sharpening swords or planning their next raid. Viking leisure was a brief, yet vital respite that helped refresh the body and mind. Imagine yourself sitting in the corner of the longhouse after a long day. The fire is gently crackling, and your muscles, sore from the daily labor of chopping wood or fishing, are starting to unwind. The scent of roasted meat and freshly baked bread fills the air, and the conversations of your fellow Vikings begin to take shape. This is the time of the day where, even though the world outside may be cold and unforgiving, you can rest your mind for a while. But what did leisure mean for the Vikings? For one thing, Vikings valued relaxation and time away from their usual tasks that could be exhausting and dangerous when they weren't actively preparing for battle or tending to the land. They found ways to unwind that didn't involve plopping down in front of a television because, of course, that didn't exist. Instead, they engaged in more communal forms of entertainment, where stories and social interaction were just as important as rest. One of the most important and relaxing activities for Vikings was feasting. Feasts were not just about eating, but about coming together as a community. Think of it as a social reset, a time to share food, tell stories, and laugh together. Vikings didn't have the luxury of easy travel or constant contact with distant family members, so these communal feasts were a vital way of maintaining social bonds. Whether it was a simple evening meal in the longhouse, or a grand feast celebrating a successful raid or a seasonal change, these meals allowed Vikings to rest, recharge, and connect with one another. But feasts weren't the only form of leisure. In Viking life, there was also the crucial art of storytelling. Yes, storytelling, just as it has been for so many cultures throughout history, was central to Viking leisure. The Vikings loved stories, especially tales of gods, heroes, and epic adventures, and they didn't just sit quietly and listen. They were active participants in these narratives. The telling of stories was often accompanied by music, the plucking of a stringed instrument like the lyre or a rhythmic beat on a drum. The atmosphere was full of laughter, surprise, and even the occasional gasp at a twist in the tale. It was an interactive, engaging experience. Now, here's a quirky tidbit for you. Vikings loved to boast. Well, not in the way we think of boasting today, but as a form of oral tradition. They would engage in something called flyting, which was essentially a form of competitive boasting and verbal sparring. This wasn't just about bragging rights. It was a sport in its own right. Vikings would compete to come up with the most creative and cutting jabs, all in good fun. It might sound a bit strange to us, but flyting was a way for Vikings to engage in social banter and keep their minds sharp. You could imagine a group of Vikings sitting around the fire, exchanging sharp-witted remarks and testing each other's verbal agility. Storytelling and flyting weren't the only ways Vikings unwound, though. They were also incredibly skilled at various forms of recreation that involved skill, strategy, and, yes, sometimes a bit of competition. One of their favorite pastimes was playing games that required both mental and physical prowess. Board games. Like Hennefertoff, a Viking strategy game similar to chess, were common. In Hennefertoff, two players would face off with the goal of either capturing or rescuing the king piece, all while planning a series of clever moves. Though it might seem like a simple game, it required critical thinking, foresight, and strategy traits that every Viking needed, whether in battle or in life. Even if the Vikings didn't have the same kind of relaxation practices we think of today, these games, stories, and feasts provided them with the mental and emotional recovery they needed to face their next challenge. Historians still argue whether these leisure activities were just a distraction from the harsh realities of Viking life, or whether they were truly essential for the Vikings' mental and emotional well-being. Some suggest that leisure activities, such as feasting and storytelling, were critical to maintaining morale during the long, cold winters. Others believe that they were simply another form of bonding, ensuring that their tight-knit communities remained strong. No matter which side of the debate you fall on, one thing is clear: leisure was deeply important to Viking life. Their downtime wasn't about doing nothing. It was about recharging, connecting, and preparing for the challenges ahead. When they weren't sharpening their axes or building ships, they were sharpening their minds and their relationships with others. Interestingly, Viking leisure wasn't always about individual activities. Much like their rest, it was often communal, and it reinforced the tight bonds between family and friends. While the Vikings were certainly fierce warriors, their downtime showed a different side of their character side that valued social bonds, mental sharpness, and community cohesion. Whether it was around the hearth, during a feast, or in the midst of a lively flyting session, these moments of relaxation were what allowed Vikings to maintain their warrior mentality. By resting their bodies and minds in these ways, they were able to face the physical and emotional tolls of their difficult lives. So, if you think about it, Viking leisure was really just another way of recharging, except instead of closing your eyes and taking a nap, you were engaging with your community, sharpening your skills, and maybe enjoying a hearty laugh or two. It wasn't all about sitting back and doing nothing. Viking leisure was about balance, about taking time to be with the people who mattered, and about engaging in activities that fed the body, mind, and spirit. As we move further into this exploration of Viking rest, let's take a step back and think about the larger picture. Vikings were often seen as the epitome of fierce warriors, always ready to strike at a moment's notice. But they were also people who understood the value of downtime, of taking time away from the constant grind. Their leisurely pursuits, whether it was a game of Hennefertoff, a hearty meal, or a bit of storytelling, were vital in giving them the energy and strength they needed to return to their duties with renewed vigor. In the end, Viking leisure was about much more than simply passing the time. It was a way of nurturing the relationships that kept their communities intact. And in a world as harsh and unpredictable as theirs, that was a rest worth having. After all the communal rest and leisure, you might think that a Viking's life was a constant cycle of relaxation and feast. But no, as peaceful as those moments were, the Vikings' busy, action-packed days demanded just as much physical exertion as mental relaxation. And here we arrive at the art of the nap, or what you might call a daytime rest in Viking life. Now, it's not like Vikings had cozy beanbags or nap pods to flop into. Their version of napping was pragmatic, sharp, and rejuvenating. Napping was more than just a luxury for Vikings. It was a practical necessity. We've all had that moment during the day when the sun's heat weighs on you, or you've worked so long that your body just says, "Nope, we need a break." Vikings, living in the cold and unpredictable northern climates, had a unique way of looking at the human need for rest. With such a harsh environment, there was no room for wasting time. Every moment had to count. But that didn't mean they didn't take time for themselves. In fact, resting throughout the day helped Vikings manage the physically demanding, unpredictable nature of their lives. Imagine the scenario. It's mid-morning. The day's work has begun. You've tended to the animals, worked on the fire, and now the day is ahead of you. Instead of pushing through exhaustion, Vikings would allow themselves the brief but efficient rest of a short nap. This wasn't about sinking into a deep slumber or wasting the day. This was about taking a brief, purposeful pause to recharge. After all, there were boats to build, crops to harvest, and threats to be dealt with. But taking that quick break helped reset the mind and body, preparing for whatever task came next. Historians still debate how common this midday nap truly was. Some claim it was a widespread practice in Viking society, a healthy break from the hard work of survival. Others argue that napping was reserved for only the most exhausted members of the community, or those who could afford such rest. However, there's enough evidence that suggests a form of rest or downtime was interwoven with the Viking daily routine. Remember, the Vikings often worked from dawn to dusk, and even the strongest warriors needed a break. One thing we do know for sure is that Vikings understood the importance of energy management. They knew that the rhythm of their day had to balance work and rest. And so napping, whether it was for 15 minutes or an hour, was likely a strategic way to ensure that their energy reserves weren't depleted too early. Imagine being out at sea for weeks, fighting battles and constantly adjusting to the elements. A brief nap would be just the kind of reset needed to stay sharp and alert. It's a kind of rest that recognizes that the body, no matter how strong, is still just a machine, one that requires care and maintenance. On the flip side, Viking culture also didn't subscribe to the idea that rest meant doing nothing. Even when they rested, they were often still engaged in some activity, whether it was cleaning weapons, making armor repairs, or tending to their boats. Their version of rest wasn't a complete shutdown. It was a pause in action before returning to the grind. Think of it as a strategic retreat that allowed you to regroup, reassess, and continue with purpose. While some of us may have modern conveniences like coffee breaks or lounge areas, the Viking nap was essentially built into their everyday activities. It wasn't about finding time for a nap. It was about recognizing that rest was needed to maintain productivity. Much like how we take micro breaks in the middle of a workday to prevent burnout, the Vikings took short, strategic pauses to ensure that they didn't overexert themselves. It was, in a way, an ancient form of self-care, long before the term was ever coined. But rest for the Vikings wasn't always an individual experience. Their society was deeply communal, and as such, their napping habits likely varied depending on the context. During the colder months, when daylight was short and the temperature dropped significantly, rest took on a different character. Families would gather around the hearth and rest together, their bodies warming in the flickering light of the fire. This communal rest helped reinforce the bonds of the Viking community, where everyone's well-being was tied to the group's survival. It was as much a social act as a physical one, and even when resting, the Vikings were engaging with each other. Viking naps were also somewhat dictated by the seasons. In the dark, cold winters, when there was less work to be done and fewer daylight hours, napping was far more common. It was a time for Vikings to conserve energy while waiting for the spring thaw, when they would once again set out to raid or expand their territories. The rhythm of their days reflected the changing seasons. In contrast, the summer months, when the days were long and the tasks abundant, meant less time for rest and more for working the fields, hunting, and maintaining ships. This seasonal approach to rest and activity was perfectly suited to Viking survival, allowing them to balance the needs of their physical bodies with the demands of nature and society. Interestingly, Vikings weren't the only ones who recognized the importance of naps in maintaining energy levels. Across many cultures, especially those that relied on physical labor, naps were seen as a healthy, natural part of daily life. In modern times, we've come to recognize the benefits of naps in terms of cognitive function, mood, and physical health. The Vikings, though, had no scientific backing to validate their practices, but they didn't need it. Their lifestyles were enough of a testament to the importance of rest. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. The Vikings weren't just great warriors, they were also skilled navigators. Their journeys across the seas required incredible precision and endurance. A single misstep could lead to disaster, so maintaining sharpness was crucial. Could it be that those short midday naps were a strategy for staying sharp, particularly when they were out at sea? It's entirely possible. Sailors have long known the importance of napping to combat fatigue during long journeys, and the Vikings would have had similar strategies to manage their energy. The Viking belief in the importance of recharging through rest, whether through naps or communal activities, wasn't just about avoiding exhaustion. It was an understanding of how vital rest was to overall survival. A warrior who was too tired or too mentally exhausted wouldn't perform well in battle, and a farmer who was run down would not be able to contribute to the community. Viking rest, especially in the form of naps, allowed them to remain alert, active, and ready for whatever came next. In the grand scheme of things, Viking naps weren't about luxury or comfort, they were about efficiency. A quick pause, a short break from the day's work, allowed them to stay focused, maintain stamina, and continue their cycle of action and rest. It wasn't indulgent, but it was practical. In a world where every second counted, where every resource was precious, napping was a strategic decision. It wasn't about being lazy, it was about being ready. So next time you're considering your own midday break, think of the Vikings. They understood the importance of rest long before we had all the fancy terminology for it. A quick nap, a short pause, a brief moment of rest, these were all part of the rhythm that kept their communities alive, thriving, and ready to face the challenges that awaited them. Let's pause and reflect on a moment that's more than just a break from the grind. Picture the afternoon sun slowly climbing higher in the sky, its warmth offering a soothing contrast to the coolness of the early morning hours. The workday is in full swing, yet there's a natural lull in the air just before the energy of the evening picks up. For the Vikings, this was often the perfect time to take a brief respite, a moment for what you might call a Nordic siesta. Unlike the intense, productivity-driven hustle we often associate with modern work culture, Viking society embraced the slower rhythms of nature. This was a time to ease into the afternoon, allowing both the body and mind to refresh before the busy evening ahead. The siesta, a short midday rest, wasn't about retreating into a quiet room and shutting out the world. No, the Viking version was far more integrated into their daily life. That was about taking a moment to recalibrate before the final push of the day. It wasn't the same as the naps they took in the early mornings or after the evening meal. It was an intentional, quieter kind of rest that prepared the Vikings for the mental and physical demands of the evening hours. Imagine yourself slipping away from the tasks of the day, finding a quiet corner of the longhouse, or stepping outside for a brief escape into nature. The sun is warm, the breeze cool, and you lay down on the soft earth, your body sinking into the ground, its weight grounding you. The soft rustling of the trees and the hum of distant animal life become the soundtrack to your rest. This short, restful break wasn't just a luxury, it was an integral part of Viking life, one that allowed them to recover from the heavy labor of the morning and get ready for the challenges of the afternoon and evening. The practice of taking a midday break was not only practical but essential to Viking survival. Their days were long, full of physical labor and constant vigilance, particularly when they weren't at home in the longhouse. Whether on a raid or maintaining the farm, the Vikings spent hours working the land, sailing ships, or honing their combat skills. A short, restorative pause helped them recharge for the physical and mental challenges ahead. It wasn't just about sleeping, it was about strategically resetting for what was to come next. Historians still debate the prevalence of the Viking afternoon siesta, as records on Viking daily life are limited. However, there are indications that they did recognize the need for short bursts of rest throughout the day. In a world where you couldn't simply take a day off, napping during these in-between moments provided the necessary energy to continue working through the day. In essence, these midday breaks helped the Vikings stay sharp, focused, and energized, especially when they had to face physical demands later in the day. Whether working the fields, preparing for another battle, or building their iconic ships, this practice allowed them to maintain stamina and physical readiness for what lay ahead. Now, the idea of taking a midday break to recharge wasn't unique to the Vikings. Cultures across the world have long recognized the importance of a siesta, taking a break during the hottest hours of the day, when energy levels would naturally dip. In Mediterranean cultures, for example, the tradition of the afternoon rest is a well-known practice, but in the case of the Vikings, the unique geographical challenges of their northern homelands gave this practice a different flavor. The Vikings weren't just fighting fatigue from long, hard days, they were also fighting the harsh environment that surrounded them. The cold, the isolation, and the unpredictability of the land meant that they had to be constantly alert. The midday rest, then, was not just about physical recovery. It was about mental clarity, preparation, and conserving energy for the rigors of the colder months. when the weather would often confine them indoors for extended periods of time. But the Viking siesta wasn't always about quiet moments of solitude. During the daylight hours, social interactions were still a key component of Viking life. While a Viking might retreat to rest during the midday hours, it wasn't always a solitary affair. Families and close-knit communities often engaged in communal activities during the afternoon, and these interactions offered a different kind of rester, mental and emotional recharge. Gathering round the fire, telling stories, or working together on a shared task allowed Vikings to bond, share knowledge, and rest their minds before returning to the physical labor of the day. One quirky tidbit to note here: some historians suggest that the Vikings might have had a very different concept of rest from what we consider it today. Rest wasn't necessarily about inactivity, but about balance. Even their downtime could involve mild physical activity or engagement in mental challenges. Whether it was the act of crafting, fixing tools, or playing games, these activities still allowed for the replenishment of energy without sacrificing productivity. Viking rest was, in essence, a form of engaged recovery, always in motion, but always purposeful. Viking siestas were also closely tied to the changing seasons. During the harsh winters, when daylight hours were short and the cold seemed unrelenting, a midday rest was a welcome opportunity to conserve energy. With fewer hours of daylight, the Vikings had to make the most of the hours they had. The colder months often meant more time indoors, but it also allowed for rest periods that were not as readily available during the busy spring and summer months. This seasonal shift not only affected work schedules, but also had a direct impact on rest and leisure. During the winter, when survival itself required more energy and endurance, the practice of midday rest, or a simple pause in the day, allowed the Vikings to pace themselves for the long, grueling months ahead. Now, let's consider the psychological aspect of these midday breaks. In a world as volatile as the Viking one, rest was just as much about mental fortitude as it was about physical recovery. The Vikings lived under constant threat, whether from nature, their enemies, or the ever-changing demands of their environment. Taking a moment to step back from the stress of the day allowed them to reset their minds and prepare for the uncertainties ahead. In many ways, these moments of rest, both physical and mental, helped them navigate the chaotic and often violent world they inhabited. Whether it was a simple moment of silence or a brief escape into nature, these pauses in the day provided a necessary foundation for the mental clarity required in their dangerous and unpredictable lives. Even today, we recognize the importance of these breaks. Short, effective rests throughout the day can improve focus, memory, and overall well-being. While modern society often discourages taking breaks in favor of constant productivity, the Vikings knew that taking a pause was vital to maintaining their edge. By following the natural rhythms of the body and mind, the Vikings were able to maintain the energy and alertness needed to thrive in a harsh world. So, whether it was taking a nap in the warmth of the longhouse, retreating to the quiet of the outdoors, or simply resting from physical labor, the Viking siesta was an essential component of their daily life. It allowed them to reset, recharge, and prepare for the challenges that awaited them. In a world that required constant vigilance, their understanding of the importance of rest kept them resilient and strong, ready for whatever came next. Now, let's focus on the kind of rest that filled the Vikings with both physical and emotional nourishment. Their meals? No, this isn't a segment about how Vikings feasted on roasted wild boar and swigged down mead, though that part is fun. 2. What we're diving into is the cultural significance of meals in Viking society, where the act of sitting down together for a meal was not just about filling up on food. It was a way to rest, share stories, bond with family, and even find moments of reflection amid the chaos of their lives. In the Viking world, meals were far from being a rushed, impersonal affair. After a long day of labor, whether it was building ships, tending to animals, or preparing for an upcoming raid gathering around a table, or more likely, a fire in the longhouse, wasn't just about replenishing physical energy. It was a time for emotional and social restoration. These communal meals offered a brief reprieve from the intensity of Viking life, providing comfort and connection. Meals for Vikings often centered around simple but nourishing food, based on what was available from the land and sea around them. Meat, particularly pork, beef, and lamb, was a mainstay of Viking meals. Fish was another essential part of the Viking diet, especially for those living closer to the coast. It wasn't always about elaborate feasts, though. Many meals were simple, hearty, and practical: stews, soups, bread, and other basic staples that provided sustenance. And if you happened to be part of a larger feast, well, you could expect more extravagant food, including roasted meats, pies, bread, and even dairy products like cheese. The cultural context of these meals was just as important as the food itself. For Vikings, eating together was an act of community and unity. It wasn't uncommon for several families to share a large longhouse. And when it came time for meals, they all gathered together, sitting round the fire, passing bowls and plates from hand to hand, and sharing what they had. This communal aspect of Viking meals wasn't just about sharing food, it was about sharing life. It was an opportunity for Vikings to slow down, bond with their fellow warriors, tell stories, and reflect on the day. Now, one quirky aspect of Viking meals was how they would drink. The Vikings were well known for their love of mead, the fermented honey drink that became something of a cultural symbol for their people. But their drinking habits weren't exactly like we think of today. In Viking society, mead wasn't always a drink for getting drunk, though, let's be honest. They certainly knew how to enjoy it. Mead was often part of the meal, shared in a communal cup. It was a drink to be passed around, with each person taking a sip before handing the cup to the next. This wasn't about getting tipsy in a drunken stupor. It was about sharing in the experience, building social cohesion, and engaging in a kind of ceremonial bonding. The significance of sharing a meal together wasn't just for practicalities. Sakit was also a reflection of the Vikings' worldview. Their culture, like many ancient societies, placed great value on kinship and relationships. The act of sitting down to eat together was an affirmation of the bonds between family and tribe. For Vikings, eating wasn't something that could be done alone or in silence. It was a communal event, and these shared meals helped reinforce the values of cooperation, loyalty, and mutual support that were essential to Viking survival. But how did they eat? What kind of utensils did they use? Well, the Vikings didn't have the refined silverware or forks and knives that we use today. Instead, they ate with their hands, or with simple tools made from bone or wood, like spoons and knives. These were functional items, not designed for elegance, but for practicality. And given the often rough conditions under which they lived, meals weren't always taken at a neatly set table. More often than not, meals were served on large wooden platters or bowls, and everyone would eat together, sharing what was available. Even the way Vikings prepared their food shows how rest and leisure were integrated into their lives. Take, for example, the tradition of smoking and drying fish or meat. This method of preservation allowed the Vikings to store food for the winter months when fresh supplies were scarce. It also meant that meals could be prepared more simply during the colder months, requiring less time and effort to cook. When you consider how much time the Vikings spent preparing and storing food, it's clear that they understood the importance of efficiency, but also of making the most of what they had in the moment. Even in their meals, there was an underlying rhythm, a gentle pace that helped them rest and recharge for the challenges of the day. Now, let's dig a bit deeper into the ritualistic aspects of meals in Viking culture. After a battle or raid, when the warriors returned home, it wasn't just the physical rewards they looked forward to, it was the meal they'd shared together. These post-battle feasts were a time for victory, reflection, and rest. The Viking warriors would often come together in the longhouse, where they would celebrate their triumphs with food, drink, and storytelling. These feasts were as much about emotional recovery as they were about physical replenishment. They were a collective sigh of relief after the tension and brutality of combat, a time to rest mentally and physically, letting the body process the adrenaline of battle. Historians still argue over how much of Viking culture revolved around feasting and the communal experience of meals. Some scholars suggest that these meals were as much about social cohesion as they were about nutrition. After all, the Vikings' survival depended on their ability to function as a unified group, and meals were a central component of that unity. Others claim that the feasts were more about status and the display of wealth and power, a chance for chieftains and wealthy families to show off their resources and gain favor with their followers. Regardless of the purpose, there's no denying the central role that meals played in the Viking way of life, offering a brief but essential rest from the harsh demands of their world. In addition to providing sustenance, meals in Viking society were also a form of mental relaxation. For a brief moment during the day, Vikings could take a step back from their busy, often dangerous lives, sharing a meal with others and enjoying the comfort of familiar company. These communal meals helped reset their minds, allowing them to face the challenges of the coming hours with renewed focus. Rest, after all, isn't just about physical recovery, it's about mental and emotional restoration. To do so, the next time you sit down for a meal, whether it's a casual lunch or a grand dinner, think of the Vikings and how their meals were. More than just about eating, they were about rest, connection, and bonding. They were a reminder of the importance of pausing, of taking a moment to nourish not just the body, but the spirit as well. And for the Vikings, these moments of rest, gathered around a fire with friends and family, were just as vital to their survival as any battle strategy or shipbuilding technique. Now, as we move further into the Vikings' world of rest, we can't overlook one of the most comforting and restful activities in their daily routine: storytelling. Yes, storytelling. You might think of storytelling as just entertainment, a way to pass the time around the fire, but for the Vikings, it was so much more than that. It was a means of rest, a way to relax the mind and soul after a long, exhausting day of work or battle. But also, these stories were not just for fun, they served as a mechanism to bond with one another, to reinforce cultural values, and to process the often brutal realities of their world. Picture yourself sitting by the hearth, the crackling fire casting a warm glow on your face. The room is filled with the sounds of hushed voices, everyone leaning in to hear the next line of the tale. You're wrapped in furs, perhaps a bit tired from the day's chores, but as the story unfolds, the fatigue slips away. The storyteller, whether young or old, masterfully weaves a tale of gods, monsters, heroes, or distant lands. With each word, you're transported away from the harsh, cold, and unpredictable world outside. It's a mental escape, a way for the Vikings to rest and refresh their minds before the next day's work. In Viking culture, stories were passed down orally, and they weren't just casual tales, they were deeply woven into the fabric of Viking life. These stories had a purpose, beyond just being entertaining. They were a way of communicating the values and history of the Viking people. They reinforced the ideals of bravery, loyalty, and the importance of family and kinship. And in many ways, these stories helped Vikings process the hardships of their world. They were a way of coping with the challenges of survival. And, most importantly, they were a way to rest the mind and bring a sense of peace after the chaos of the day. Storytelling was also a form of mental rest because it allowed the Vikings to immerse themselves in something different. After a day of labor, the last thing anyone wanted was more stress. But listening to stories about the gods, the creation of the world, or the adventures of great warriors was a form of escapism. The mind could briefly step away from the mundane and the harsh reality of survival, and instead imagine the world through different lenses. Stories offered a kind of psychological release, a break from the constant demands of daily life. Moreover, these stories were told in the most engaging way. The storyteller, often accompanied by music or the rhythm of a drum, would bring the tale to life with gestures and expressions. It was more than just reciting words. It was a full performance that captivated the audience. Imagine the emotional intensity of a Viking telling a tale of the gods or recounting the latest raid. You could feel the tension rise as the story built, and then, just as quickly, the relief as the hero triumphed or the challenge was overcome. The whole experience was a release of emotions, joy, sorrow, fear, and triumph. For Vikings, this wasn't just entertainment. It was an emotional reset. One interesting aspect of Viking storytelling is the role of the skalds. Skalds were poets or bards who were highly respected in Viking society. They were the ones who composed and recited stories, often at feasts or during other important gatherings. These poets were highly skilled in their craft and had the ability to weave complex narratives that could inspire and uplift, as well as provide rest and relaxation for their listeners. In fact, the skalds were considered so important that they often traveled with Viking warriors, not only to chronicle their battles, but also to boost morale with their tales. There's also the peculiar tradition of flyting, which was a form of poetic contest that could be seen as both a form of leisure and a kind of social play. In flyting, two individuals would engage in a contest of insults, often using clever wordplay and metaphors to outdo one another. While it might sound like an argument, it was actually a form of entertainment and social bonding. It helped to sharpen the mind and, at times, could bring laughter and rest after a long day of hard work. The humor involved in flyting was often used to release tension and was considered an important part of Viking leisure and rest. The power of storytelling extended beyond just relaxation, though it was an educational tool. Through stories, young Vikings learned about their history, their culture, and their gods. They learned the virtues of being a warrior, the importance of loyalty, and the value of strength and courage. The stories were filled with moral lessons that the Vikings carried with them into their daily lives. These tales helped to instill the values of Viking society, and while they provided mental rest and entertainment, they also ensured that the cultural ideals were passed on to the younger generations. Interestingly, some historians argue that Viking storytelling was a form of collective mental health. The constant pressure of survival, the ever-present threat of raids, and the harsh conditions of Viking life could easily lead to stress, anxiety, and mental fatigue. Storytelling allowed the Vikings to process these stresses in a safe, controlled manner. By immersing themselves in tales of gods and heroes, they could reflect on their own lives and find solace in knowing that they, too, were part of something larger than themselves. It was a way of making sense of the chaos around them, offering a sense of control and peace in a world that often felt out of control. But let's not forget that Viking stories were often filled with a sense of mysticism and wonder. Many of the tales involved gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, as well as fantastical creatures like giants, elves, and trolls. These stories were a way for the Vikings to explain the mysteries of their world, particularly the forces of nature they couldn't control. When the storms came or the sun disappeared behind the clouds for days, they could look to the stories and find comfort in the knowledge that the gods were at work. It was through these stories that the Vikings made sense of the world around them, allowing their minds to rest in the face of uncertainty. So, when you think of Vikings resting, don't just picture them lying down on fur rugs in front of a fire. Rest for them was just as much mental and emotional as it was physical. Their stories gave them the space to reflect, recharge, and process the stresses of the day. Through these shared moments of storytelling, the Vikings could connect with each other, bond over shared experiences, and, most importantly, rest their minds before diving back into the challenges of their world. Now, you might be thinking, I could use a good story right about now. Well, the Vikings were masters at that, weren't they? They knew the importance of pausing the chaos, slowing down the frantic pace, and letting the mind unwind through the power of words. And maybe that's a lesson we could all take with us after all, in a world that's often just as fast and frantic as the Vikings. Sometimes we need to give ourselves the space to rest, reflect, and let a good story do the heavy lifting. Now that we've explored how the Vikings rested through storytelling and communal meals, let's delve into another vital aspect of their restful rituals: music. The Vikings, like many cultures of the time, understood the power of music to restore the body and mind. It wasn't just about entertainment or celebration. Music played a pivotal role in providing mental relaxation and emotional release after the long, hard work of the day. Imagine yourself in the longhouse, the warmth of the fire flickering across your face, and the sounds of a stringed instrument echoing through the space, filling the air with melody. This was the kind of music that could soothe weary muscles and calm the most restless minds. Unlike the modern symphonies we know today, Viking music was much simpler, but no less powerful. The most common instrument in Viking society was the lyre, a stringed instrument that could be plucked to produce a soft, melodic sound. The lyre was often played to accompany poetry and storytelling, adding another layer to the emotional weight of the stories being told. But it wasn't just the lyre that contributed to the Vikings' sense of relaxation. There were also simple drums, horns, and even flutes that were used to create a soothing rhythm and melody which helped Vikings unwind. After a hard day of battle, labor, or travel, picture the scene. After a long day of working the land or preparing for a journey, a Viking warrior might settle down by the fire with his family, and one of them might pick up a lyre and begin to play. The soft, calming melodies would fill the room, casting a sense of tranquility over everyone present. There was something deeply therapeutic about music, and for the Vikings, it was an essential part of their process of unwinding. Much like how we listen to our favorite songs to relax or distress, the Vikings relied on the power of music to transport them to a mental space of calm and peace. Historians still argue about how much of Viking music was ceremonial versus recreational. Some believe that music played a crucial role in religious rituals and important social events, like feasts or meetings of the clan. Others suggest that it was mostly for personal relaxation, offering a way to soothe the mind after the physical exertion of the day, regardless of its role. Music was undeniably an important part of the Viking experience. It helped provide balance, something Vikings sorely needed as they balanced the demands of war with the need for rest and recuperation. The impact of music on Viking rest wasn't limited to its soothing effect. Music also had an essential role in emotional release. For the Vikings, who lived through constant threats of war and violence, music provided an outlet for emotions that might otherwise have been buried. The act of singing, playing an instrument, or even listening to music was a way of releasing pent-up feelings and finding catharsis. Music allowed them to process the complex emotions that came with their harsh, often brutal lives, giving them a break from the constant pressure of survival. Furthermore, music brought people together. It wasn't just an individual experience, it was a shared one. Just as meals were communal events, music played an integral part in socializing and connecting with others. A Viking feast or gathering wasn't complete without someone picking up an instrument to play and sing. These moments were opportunities for the clan to bond, relax, and share in the collective joy of music. In a world that often demanded so much from each individual, these moments of togetherness through music helped restore the social and emotional fabric of Viking life. The physical act of making music also served as a form of relaxation. For example, playing a stringed instrument like the lyre required careful attention and focus. This could take the player's mind off the stresses of daily life and immerse them in the rhythm of the music itself. Even just strumming a chord could create a meditative atmosphere, providing mental rest. This kind of focused activity allowed the Vikings to escape, even momentarily, from the harsh realities of their world and immerse themselves in a mental state of calm. In addition to emotional release, music also served as a form of social rest. The act of gathering together to listen to music or share a song was one of the few times when Vikings could step away from the rigid demands of daily life and simply exist in a shared moment of peace. These moments didn't just refresh the individual, they refreshed the community as a whole, helping to strengthen bonds and reaffirm connections between family, friends, and fellow warriors. Music wasn't just a personal escape, it was a collective experience that allowed the Vikings to rest together, drawing strength from one another in a way that few other activities could. And let's not forget the connection between Viking music and their spirituality. Music wasn't just about relaxation, it was also a form of communication with the gods. For the Vikings, music could have a sacred, ritualistic quality. The sounds of instruments and voices might be used in religious ceremonies, invoking the gods or asking for protection in battle. The act of playing or singing could be seen as a form of devotion, a way of finding rest and solace in the divine. In a culture where spirituality was deeply tied to daily life, music offered a way to align the physical world with the spiritual one. The Vikings' relationship with music also extended to their mythological traditions. The gods themselves were often depicted as having a connection to music and the arts. For example, The god Odin was said to have been able to play the harp beautifully, using his music to inspire and guide his followers. This link between the gods and music only reinforced its importance in Viking culture. Music wasn't just a way to relax, it was a way to communicate with the divine and to find peace in a world that was often chaotic. Perhaps one of the most intriguing aspects of Viking music was its adaptability. While the Vikings may not have had modern recording devices or instruments, they were incredibly resourceful when it came to creating music. They used materials from their environment, such as bone, wood, and even animal skins, to create their instruments. This connection between music and the natural world helped reinforce the idea that rest was not just about escaping the harshness of life. It was about connecting with the earth, the community, and the divine. Music, in this sense, was a form of holistic rest that allowed the Vikings to recharge both physically and spiritually. So, the next time you find yourself in need of a mental break or looking for a way to unwind, consider the power of music. Just as the Vikings used their instruments and voices to find peace in their chaotic world, we too can find relaxation in the soothing power of sound. Whether it's a favorite song or a calming melody, music has the ability to bring us back to ourselves, helping us find rest in the midst of a busy world. And for the Vikings, who balanced the weight of survival with the need for connection, music was their tool for emotional and mental recovery. It was just another way that they found rest, comfort, and peace in a world that demanded so much from them. And who knows, maybe a bit of Viking music might do us all some good when we need a moment to rest and recharge. Asterisk. As we continue to explore the rhythms of Viking rest, we cannot forget the role of sleep rituals. The Vikings, like all cultures, needed to recharge at night to maintain their strength for the challenges ahead. But while sleep might seem like an obvious and straightforward form of rest, the way the Vikings approached it was actually quite structured, influenced by both practical and spiritual beliefs. It's often easy to overlook the simple necessity of sleep, but the way Vikings prepared for rest both mentally and physically was as much a ritual as it was a survival strategy, and it helped them embrace a restful sleep that would prepare them for the difficult demands of their days. Imagine this. The longhouse is dimly lit by the warm glow of a low fire. The air smells faintly of smoke, and the crackling fire provides a soft backdrop for the quiet evening. The evening meal has been eaten, the chores for the day completed, and now it's time to wind down. But there's no rush to fall asleep, no frantic scroll through your phone, no counting down the minutes until you have to get up. Instead, the Vikings would prepare their minds and bodies for a restful night's sleep in a way that mirrored the rhythms of nature. The longhouse was quiet, with people preparing for sleep in a manner that was calm and deliberate, setting the tone for a peaceful night. Viking sleep wasn't about sinking into a soft bed with pillows. They didn't have our modern luxuries, but their sleep environment was still geared toward rest. Bedding typically consisted of thick furs, which were not only useful for warmth, but also for comfort during long winter nights. These furs, along with woolen blankets, helped insulate the body from the cold, particularly during the frigid months of the year. Vikings also had straw mats to lie on, which may not sound luxurious, but they served the purpose of providing a more even surface to sleep on than the hard, wooden floors of the longhouse. It's important to note that Viking sleep wasn't necessarily about a long stretch of uninterrupted rest, like we often seek today. In fact, some historical evidence suggests that the Vikings and many ancient cultures may have had a segmented sleep cycle. They would sleep for a few hours, wake up for a period of time in the middle of the night, and then sleep again. This was a natural rhythm that allowed for a restful period during the night, while also accommodating the need for alertness. It was an adaptive strategy perfectly suited for the unpredictable nature of Viking life, where they couldn't afford to be caught unawares during the dark hours. You could imagine waking up in the middle of the night, perhaps listening for the sounds of any danger or simply embracing a moment of quiet reflection, before drifting back off into a second sleep cycle. Historians still debate whether this segmented sleep pattern was a common practice across all Viking households, or if it was more of a rural or survival-based tradition. Some scholars argue that Vikings, especially those living in smaller, isolated communities, had to adapt to this style of sleep due to the challenges of survival. With fewer people around and more dangers to be wary of, it made sense for Vikings to rest in cycles, staying alert during the night when needed, but also allowing their bodies to fully rest for short periods. For Viking warriors, the need for sleep was especially crucial. A warrior who didn't sleep well or had trouble resting could be sluggish in battle, mentally worn down, and physically vulnerable. A good night's sleep, or at least the practice of proper rest, was key to maintaining the stamina necessary for those moments of intense action. The simple rituals of winding down, sitting around the fire, talking quietly with fellow warriors, and reflecting on the day were designed to ease the body and mind into a state of rest. For these warriors, sleep was not an afterthought. It was a strategic part of their daily regimen, even during the busiest times, such as the days before a raid or during the harsh winter months when the tribe was confined to their lot. Sleep remained an important part of their mental and physical preparation. The Vikings, like most ancient cultures, didn't have clocks or watches to tell them the time. They used the natural rhythms of the world around them to gauge when it was time to rest and when it was time to wake. The rising and setting of the sun, the changing of the seasons, and the sounds of nature all played a role in regulating their sleep patterns. The transition from day to night was a time for winding down, and just as the world around them slowed, so too did the pace of their lives. As the fire burned down low and the conversations settled, the Vikings would prepare for their sleep by closing the doors of the longhouse, insulating themselves from the cold, and pulling their furs tightly around them. The night was a time for rest and recovery, a necessary part of their survival in many ways. The Vikings' approach to sleep was closely tied to their connection with nature. The cycle of rest wasn't just about recuperating from a day's work, it was about reconnecting with the natural world, aligning their bodies with the rhythms of the earth. Sleep was a way of respecting the natural forces around them, acknowledging that even the fiercest warriors needed to rest. By following the natural order of the day and night, the Vikings maintained a sense of balance in their lives, allowing them to stay sharp, strong, and capable of facing whatever challenges might come their way. While Vikings didn't have access to the modern science of sleep that we do today, they had an intuitive understanding of the importance of rest. Sleep wasn't just a luxury or a break from the day. It was a vital component of their overall well-being. It gave them the energy to hunt, to fight, and to build the ships that would carry them across the seas. It was their foundation of strength, mental, emotional, and physical. The importance of rest was understood even in their most demanding hours, and it was embedded in their daily routines. One quirky tidbit about Viking sleep was their belief in the power of dreams. Dreams were not just considered a random mix of thoughts, they were seen as messages from the gods, signals about the future, or glimpses of fate. For the Vikings, dreams were a way to connect with the divine and understand their place in the world. Before going to sleep, some Vikings would offer small prayers or speak to the gods, asking for guidance or protection. In this sense, sleep was not just a physical necessity but a spiritual experience. The ritual of rest was seen as a way to bridge the waking world with the world of the gods, where insights and visions could emerge from the subconscious mind in some ways. This belief in the divine power of sleep helped the Vikings maintain their mental clarity and strength. By taking rest seriously both in terms of physical relaxation and spiritual reflection, they were able to approach their challenges with a sense of purpose and confidence. Rest wasn't just a matter of recovering from the day's work. It was about renewing the spirit, aligning oneself with higher forces, and preparing for whatever the next day might bring. So, as we step back and reflect on Viking rest, it's clear that their approach was far more holistic than just about sleep or relaxation. It was about balance, reflection, and preparation. Whether they were taking a midday nap, enjoying a communal meal, resting through storytelling, or winding down for sleep, the Vikings understood that rest was as much a part of their survival as their battles or voyages. It was essential for maintaining their strength, fortitude, and mental clarity, qualities that allowed them to thrive in the harsh world they inhabited. Asterisk. As we continue our exploration into Viking rest, let's take a closer look at the spiritual side of relaxation. While many of the ways in which Vikings rested were physical napping, communal meals, or time spent around the hearth, they also deeply understood the importance of spiritual and mental rest. The Vikings lived in a world shaped by powerful forces, gods, nature, and fate, so their rituals for rest were often intertwined with spiritual practices that helped them reconnect with the divine, restore their sense of purpose, and realign themselves with the world around them. Spiritual rest wasn't about escaping the world's demands. It was about finding a deeper connection with the forces that governed Viking life. The Vikings believed in a host of gods: Odin, Thor, Freya, and many others, and each one had a role to play in their daily lives. From birth to death, everything was shaped by these divine beings, and the Vikings knew that it was vital to maintain a strong spiritual connection with them to stay grounded in an often unpredictable world. At the heart of Viking spirituality was a strong sense of fate, or word. This concept, often translated as fate or destiny, was central to their worldview. The Vikings believed that their lives were shaped by powerful forces both in this world and in the afterlife that they could not control. Word was seen as an inescapable force, and it was believed that each person's fate had already been decided by the gods. For the Vikings, this sense of fate wasn't something to fear, it was something to accept. It gave them a sense of peace, knowing that they had a purpose in life, and that even in the face of hardship, there was a higher order at work. But how did this belief in fate connect to their rest? It was a comforting thought for the Vikings, especially after a long day of physical and emotional toil. Knowing that their struggles and hardships were part of a larger divine plan allowed them to rest more peacefully, without the burden of constantly questioning their circumstances. The belief that the gods were watching over them, and that their lives were not random but part of a grander scheme, gave them the mental and spiritual space to truly rest. Viking spiritual practices were integral to helping them align their mind, body, and soul. For example, before heading into battle or embarking on a journey, a Viking warrior might offer a prayer or make a sacrifice to the gods. These acts were not just rituals, they were a way of mentally preparing for the task ahead. The ritualistic Nature of these practices helped the Vikings focus, clear their minds, and restore their spirits before they went into battle. It was a form of rest for the psyche, a way to prepare mentally and emotionally for the challenges of the day. Even more than that, the Vikings understood that mental rest was as important as physical rest. While their bodies might be fatigued from the labor of the day, their minds also needed time to reflect, reset, and connect with the divine. This might come in the form of meditation, prayer, or simply sitting quietly by the fire, contemplating the world around them. These moments of spiritual reflection allowed them to regain balance and peace, preparing them for whatever lay ahead. Additionally, their relationship with the natural world also played a role in their spiritual rest. Vikings had a deep connection with the land, the sea, and the sky. They understood that everything around them, the wind, the trees, the animals, was imbued with power. To rest spiritually was to be in tune with the world around them, to feel the rhythms of nature and connect with something greater than themselves. Even a brief walk in the woods or by the sea could serve as a form of mental and spiritual restoration. Nature, in all its beauty and danger, was both a source of sustenance and a reminder of the larger forces at play in their lives. One of the most important rituals of Viking spiritual rest was the bedtime sacrifice to the gods. Vikings believed that the gods needed offerings to maintain balance in the world, and so they would perform sacrifices to honor them. These sacrifices were often done before significant events, such as raids or voyages, and they were meant to ensure divine favor and protection. But these sacrifices were also a way for the Vikings to rest mentally and spiritually. By giving thanks to the gods and asking for their guidance, the Vikings could release their worries and uncertainties. The act of sacrifice was a form of letting go of fear, doubt, and the burden of uncertainty, and allowing themselves to trust in the gods' protection. This practice was not limited to major life events, either. The Vikings would often engage in smaller, personal rituals of thanks and reflection throughout their lives. These could be simple offerings of food, drink, or even prayers said quietly before going to sleep. These acts of spiritual connection helped them create a sense of calm and assurance, knowing that they were not alone in their struggles. The divine was always present, watching over them, and this knowledge brought them peace. It was a deeply restorative form of mental rest. Moreover, the Vikings had a unique perspective on the afterlife, which also played into their understanding of rest. The concept of Valhalla, the Great Hall of Odin, was central to their beliefs. For Viking warriors, the promise of an afterlife in Valhalla was a comforting thought. It meant that death was not the end. It was just a passage to another realm, where they would be honored for their courage and strength. This belief in the afterlife gave the Vikings a sense of peace, knowing that they had a purpose beyond their physical existence. It also provided a spiritual foundation for their rest, both in life and death. The idea that their deeds would be remembered and celebrated in the afterlife allowed them to let go of the stresses of the physical world and rest assured that they were part of a larger eternal narrative. Spiritual rest also came from the belief in the good death. For the Vikings, the way they died was just as important as how they lived. A good death was one that honored the gods, family, and community. To die bravely in battle, for example, was considered the ultimate form of rest, the highest honor that a Viking warrior could achieve. This idea of a good death meant that the Vikings had a peaceful acceptance of their fate. They knew that their lives were not forever, but they were content knowing that they had lived with honor and courage. This spiritual belief brought them peace, allowing them to rest in the knowledge that they had fulfilled their purpose. In a world as harsh and brutal as the Vikings, rest wasn't just about sleep, it was about the harmony between the body, mind, and spirit. Spiritual rest was a way for the Vikings to reconnect with the divine, to feel secure in their place in the world, and to prepare for the challenges ahead. It wasn't just about escaping the hardships of life. It was about finding meaning in them, understanding that there was a higher order at play. By aligning themselves with the rhythms of the earth and the will of the gods, the Vikings could find rest in the most unexpected of places within themselves. As we close this section, it's worth considering how we, too, might benefit from integrating spiritual practices into our lives. The Vikings understood the value of a restful mind, and they used their spirituality to achieve that peace. Whether through prayer, meditation, or simply connecting with nature, we can all learn from the Vikings' example and find moments of spiritual rest in our own lives, no matter the chaos around us. As we explore more of the Vikings' approach to rest, it's crucial to consider how their connection with nature played a key role in their mental and physical relaxation. For the Vikings, nature wasn't something to be conquered or controlled. It was something to be understood, respected, and lived in harmony with. From the dense forests of Scandinavia to the freezing waters of the North Sea, nature was an ever-present part of Viking life. It shaped their daily routines, influenced their rest, and provided them with a sense of connection to the world around them. Imagine stepping outside after a long day in the longhouse. The fire is dimming, and the air is crisp. The smell of fresh earth and pine needles fills your senses. The open sky stretches out above you, the constellations of the north glimmering in the vast expanse. As you walk among the trees, you feel a sense of grounding, as if the earth itself is offering you a moment of peace after a day of labor. This connection to nature was central to the Viking experience of rest. It wasn't just about seeking physical comfort, it was about aligning oneself with the natural world, finding peace in the rhythms of the land. For the Vikings, nature was a source of both sustenance and spiritual rejuvenation. The land provided everything they needed: food, shelter, and tools. The forests, lakes, and seas were essential to their way of life, providing not only physical resources, but also moments of connection that helped restore their spirits. This was especially true during the long, harsh winters, when the Vikings often spent months confined to their homes, separated from the outside world. The ability to connect with nature, even in small ways, helped them remain mentally sharp and emotionally grounded. One of the most remarkable things about the Vikings' relationship with nature is how they recognized the rhythms of the seasons and adapted their rest accordingly. In the long summer days, when the sun lingered in the sky for what seemed like an eternity, the Vikings worked hard to harvest crops, fish, and prepare for the coming winter. The days were full of activity, with little time for rest, as they had to make the most of the fleeting warmth and daylight. But the arrival of winter brought a shift in their daily rhythms. The long, cold nights of winter were a time for rest and rejuvenation, when the Vikings could reflect, repair, and replenish their energy for the coming year. Vikings understood the importance of seasonal rest not just as a physical necessity, but as a way to recalibrate mentally and spiritually. During the winter months, when the cold was too harsh for most outdoor activities, Vikings found ways to rest more deeply. The long, dark nights were a time to reflect, tell stories, and spend time with loved ones in the warmth of the longhouse. The quiet of winter allowed for a kind of mental and spiritual rest that was difficult to achieve in the hustle of summer. It was during these months that they could reconnect with their inner selves, take stock of their lives, and prepare for the challenges of the coming seasons. In contrast, the summer was a time for vigorous activity. There was no time for long naps or extended periods of rest during the summer. The need to gather resources, hunt, and raid meant that the Vikings were constantly moving, working, and pushing themselves to the limit. But even in these busy times, nature provided opportunities for brief moments of relaxation. Whether it was a quiet break by the river or a moment of stillness in the forest, these small interactions with nature helped restore their energy and allowed them to maintain focus. The Viking connection with nature extended beyond just the physical world. It also included spiritual beliefs. The natural world was viewed as sacred, filled with divine energy and spirits. The Vikings believed that the earth, trees, rivers, and mountains were inhabited by spirits or gods who had the power to influence their lives. The Norse pantheon was filled with gods and goddesses who were deeply connected to the land. For instance, Freya, the goddess of love and fertility, was also a protector of the land and its animals. Thor, the god of thunder, was closely associated with the storms and the forces of nature that shaped the world. Many of the Vikings' spiritual practices were directly tied to their interaction with nature. Offering sacrifices to the gods, paying homage to the spirits of the land, or seeking guidance from the natural world were ways for Vikings to stay in balance with the earth. These rituals were not only about seeking divine favor, they were a way of recognizing the interconnectedness between humans, the land, and the divine. The Vikings knew that true rest didn't just come from physical sleep. It came from aligning themselves with the natural rhythms of the world, finding peace in the understanding that they were part of something larger than themselves. There is also a deeply restorative element to being in nature. Modern science tells us that spending time in natural environments, whether it's walking through a forest, sitting by a lake, or simply standing in a grassy field can lower stress levels, improve mood, and boost mental well-being. The Vikings didn't have the science to back it up, but they intuitively understood the benefits of nature. It was a source of physical and spiritual rest, offering peace when the world around them was filled with uncertainty and danger. The natural world, with its cycles of birth, growth, decay, and renewal, mirrored the Viking experience. They understood that, just like the seasons, life had its own rhythms, periods of hard work and struggle, followed by times of rest and renewal. These natural cycles helped the Vikings to rest in the knowledge that there was always a time for everything. A time to work, a time to fight, a time to celebrate, and a time to rest. Another interesting aspect of the Viking relationship with nature was their respect for sacred spaces. The Vikings often viewed certain landscapes, such as groves of trees, sacred wells, or high mountain peaks, as places of power. These were places to which they could retreat for moments of reflection, prayer, or spiritual renewal. The act of being in these sacred spaces allowed the Vikings to restore not just their physical energy, but their spiritual and mental energy as well. Nature, for the Vikings, was a place of healing, a place where they could find balance in a world that was constantly shifting and changing. The idea of connecting with nature also influenced how the Vikings approached sleeping outdoors. While the longhouse was their primary place of rest, many Vikings spent time outdoors, especially when traveling or during seasonal transitions. For the Vikings, sleeping under the open sky wasn't just a practical necessity, it was an opportunity to connect with the land in a deeper way. sleeping beneath the stars allowed them to rest with nature, aligning themselves with the natural cycles of the earth. In conclusion, nature played an essential role in the Vikings' ability to rest, both physically and mentally. Their connection to the land, the sea, and the sky provided them with a deep sense of peace and rejuvenation. By aligning themselves with the natural rhythms of the earth, the Vikings were able to find balance in a world that was constantly demanding their attention. Nature wasn't just a backdrop to their lives. It was a vital part of their rest and renewal. Whether it was through seasonal shifts, spiritual rituals, or simple moments of connection with the outdoors, the Vikings knew that true rest came from understanding and respecting the natural world. And in this, we can take a lesson. Rest doesn't just come from retreating into our homes or our beds. It comes from reconnecting with the world around us. As we continue this journey through Viking rest, let's now focus on one of the most overlooked aspects of their relaxation practices: winter rest. When you think about rest in the Viking world, your mind may immediately go to moments of reprieve after a long day of toil or battle. But winter rest, in particular, deserves special attention. The Vikings lived in a land where winters were long, harsh, and often unyielding. The short days and long nights of the Scandinavian winter shaped every aspect of Viking life, including how they approached rest, rejuvenation, and even the sense of community. Winter for the Vikings was a time when the pace of life slowed down dramatically. The cold temperatures made outdoor activities challenging, and the darkness of winter limited the time available for work. This natural slowdown created an opportunity for rest, not just for the body, but for the spirit as well. During these colder months, when the Vikings couldn't be out hunting or raiding, they turned inward toward their homes, their families, and their community. The longhouse became more than just a shelter. It became a sanctuary, a place where Viking families could come together, share warmth, and rest from the demanding rhythms of the other seasons. During winter, the daily pace of life was dramatically altered. The Vikings were no longer rushing to prepare for the summer's work or worrying about the next raid. Instead, they focused on maintaining the longhouse, repairing tools, weaving textiles, and creating food stores for the next year. The harsh conditions forced them to take breaks, as even the most seasoned warriors and farmers needed time to rest. But beyond these practical tasks, winter was also a time for reflection and spiritual renewal. With the cold, darkened sky stretching endlessly above, the Vikings took these quieter months to reconnect with their families and communities. They slowed down, ate together, and celebrated the rituals that defined their way of life. You might think that a long winter would lead to boredom or frustration, especially after a busy season of raiding or working the land. However, for the Vikings, the quiet of winter provided the perfect setting for the deep kind of rest that allowed them to refresh their minds and bodies. With long nights and short days, they had more time to sleep, to tell stories, and to reflect on the year gone by. The darkness, rather than being an inconvenience, allowed them to embrace rest in ways they couldn't do during the intense pace of the summer months. Winter rest was about more than just sleeping. It was a time to recover from the intensity of the active seasons, to heal physically and mentally. The cold and isolation of the winter months also had a social function. While the longhouse might have been a place of physical rest, it also became a place for emotional and social rest. The Viking family would gather round the fire and take the time to bond with one another, often sharing stories of battles, triumphs, and gods. These shared moments were crucial for maintaining a strong sense of community. The time spent in the warmth of the longhouse, telling tales and enjoying food together, helped reinforce social connections and provided mental rest from the isolation of the winter months. In addition to being a time of reflection and renewal, winter rest also had a spiritual aspect. The Vikings were keenly aware of the cycles of nature, and they saw winter as a time to honor the earth, the gods, and their ancestors. Winter rituals, including offerings to the gods and ceremonies around the fire, were an essential part of their rest period. By reconnecting with their spiritual beliefs, the Vikings not only rested their bodies, but also nourished their souls. The long, dark nights were a time to honor the divine, to seek guidance from the gods, and to ask for protection during the harsh months ahead. Winter was also a time when the Vikings engaged in physical rest through lighter work, while they couldn't work as intensely as they did in the summer months. The tasks they performed during winter were often more creative or restorative in nature. This could include repairing weapons or tools, weaving new garments, or creating intricate pieces of artwork. These tasks, while still requiring effort, were less physically demanding than those done during the warmer months, allowing the Vikings to continue to be productive while still preserving their energy. The winter solstice, in particular, was a time of significant cultural importance for the Vikings. The solstice marked the shortest day of the year and the beginning of the return of light. This event symbolized a kind of spiritual rebirth, a return to light and warmth after the long, dark winter. The Vikings would celebrate the solstice with feasts, offerings to the gods, and rituals to honor the sun and the changing seasons. These ceremonies provided a spiritual reset for the Vikings, allowing them to rest in the knowledge that the light would return and that they would continue to thrive physically. The winter months also offered the Vikings an opportunity to rest and heal from any injuries or illnesses that might have accumulated during the previous seasons. The harsh conditions of Viking life meant that injuries were common, especially for those who spent their days fighting, farming, or sailing. Winter gave them the time and space to recover, allowing for much-needed physical rest. Additionally, winter was a time for the Vikings to preserve and store food, ensuring that they had enough supplies to get through the colder months. This focus on preparation allowed the Vikings to feel secure in their rest, knowing that they had enough to survive until the warmer months. The Viking approach to winter rest is a great example of their ability to adapt to the challenges of their environment. They understood that rest wasn't just about doing nothing, it was about aligning with the natural rhythms of the world around them. Winter wasn't just a time of stagnation, it was a time of recuperation, renewal, and reconnection. It allowed the Vikings to build their strength for the coming year, ensuring they were ready to face the challenges ahead. Whether they were physical, spiritual, or emotional, winter rest also taught the Vikings the importance of pacing themselves. While they worked hard in the warmer months, they understood that to survive and thrive, they had to know when to slow down. The physical rest they took in winter allowed them to reset their bodies for the work that lay ahead. The time spent in the longhouse, resting and reflecting, gave them the mental clarity they needed to take on whatever challenges came their way. This balance between hard work and rest was central to Viking success, allowing them to navigate the difficulties of their environment and maintain their strength and resolve. In modern life, we often overlook the importance of winter rest, especially with the demands of our busy lives and the pressure to stay productive year-round. However, there's much we can learn from the Vikings' approach to the winter months. Taking time to slow down, to reflect, to connect with others, and to rest physically and spiritually is crucial for maintaining long-term well-being. The Vikings knew that rest wasn't just for recovery, it was an essential part of preparing for the future. By embracing the natural rhythms of the seasons, they were able to find peace in the winter months, giving them the strength they needed to continue their way of life. So, as winter approaches and the days grow shorter, consider how you can incorporate elements of Viking winter rest into your own routine. Whether it's finding moments of stillness, connecting with loved ones, or taking time to honor the changing seasons, there's value in embracing the slower pace that winter offers. In doing so, we can find a deeper sense of rest and renewal, just as the Vikings did in the heart of their long winters. As we continue to explore the Vikings' understanding of rest, it's important to recognize how their mental resilience played an essential role in their ability to recover and rejuvenate. While physical rest and spiritual practices were integral to their daily lives, the mental strength that allowed Vikings to endure hardships was just as important. Their ability to rest their minds, to recover from the mental exhaustion of their challenging lives, was a cornerstone of their survival and success. In fact, the ability to rest mentally was often more difficult than physical rest, given the constant demands placed on their minds in a world filled with uncertainty, danger, and unpredictability. The Vikings lived in a time where war, survival, and the unpredictable elements of nature were constants in their lives. Whether on a raid, at sea, or even at home during the harsh winter months, the Vikings had to remain alert and focused on the challenges that faced them. With constant threats from enemies, the need to gather resources for survival, and the ever-present struggle for dominance in their world, the Vikings' mental resilience became essential for maintaining their rest. In a world full of uncertainty, the ability to mentally rest wasn't just about relaxation, it was about finding the emotional and mental capacity to recover from the stress of their environment. Mental rest for the Vikings meant learning to balance the constant push of survival with the need to reflect, regroup, and recover from the daily grind of battle and struggle. For the Vikings, the ability to mentally rest involved a unique balance between resilience and vulnerability. They were warriors at heart, and mental strength was needed not only for battle, but also for facing the emotional toll that came with violence, loss, and uncertainty. This resilience was not just about enduring the challenges of their lives, but about learning how to navigate the psychological strains that came with being constantly on edge. The Vikings were highly aware of the mental strain their lives caused, and they made efforts to find ways to rest and recover from it. Despite the harshness of their environment, one of the ways that mental rest played a role in Viking life was through their connection to their community. In a culture where loyalty, kinship, and social bonds were highly valued, the Vikings found strength in their relationships with each other. The act of coming together, whether for a feast, a ritual, or just a moment of quiet companionship, provided the mental rest that the Vikings needed to recover from their daily mental strain. Social interaction, for the Vikings, wasn't just a luxury, it was a way to reset their minds. These moments allowed them to shift their focus away from the challenges of survival and to connect with those who shared the same burdens. Mental rest was also cultivated through rituals of reflection, whether through prayers to the gods, meditative moments before battle, or a quiet pause during the winter months. The Vikings allowed their minds to rest by acknowledging the struggles they had faced. They practiced a form of mental recovery by processing the emotional weight of their experiences. This form of mental rest helped them keep moving forward, knowing that the battles they fought, both physical and emotional, were not only endured but integrated into their understanding of their purpose. Interestingly, the Vikings did not shy away from the pain or stress of their lives. In fact, they embraced it as part of their journey. Their resilience didn't lie in avoiding emotional hardship, but in confronting it and finding ways to transform that energy into something useful. The Viking mindset wasn't about ignoring stress, was about understanding that mental resilience was a key part of the cycle of rest. Accepting the stress, the violence, and the uncertainty of their lives was integral to their ability to rest and recover. It allowed them to process hardship, learn from it, and continue on their path. For many modern societies, the idea of mental rest is often associated with techniques like meditation, mindfulness, or therapy. But the Vikings, living in a much more violent and chaotic world, found mental rest through a more communal and ritualized process. By engaging in storytelling, praying, coming together as a family, and allowing themselves moments of quiet reflection, the Vikings developed a form of mental rest that was tied to their social and spiritual values. They recognized that mental relaxation didn't come from complete detachment from the world, but from engaging with it in meaningful ways, whether through conversation, reflection, or spiritual practices. A great example of this is their use of songs and chants in preparation for battle. It wasn't just about getting fired up for combat. The Vikings used these chants and songs as a form of mental rest and emotional release. The music, rhythm, and communal aspect of these songs allowed them to confront their fears and anxieties, releasing them through the collective energy of the group. In this way, songs didn't just serve to energize, they were a tool for mentally processing the upcoming challenges. By singing together, they could rest their minds, clearing them of anxiety, and find focus and resolve. Rituals of sacrifice also played a role in mental rest. While we often think of sacrifices as being physical in nature, they were also deeply psychological and emotional. The act of offering something to the gods was, for the Vikings, a form of mental surrender. It was a way of letting go of the burdens of responsibility and control, acknowledging that certain things were beyond their influence. These sacrifices helped them mentally rest by relinquishing their anxieties about the future and trusting that the divine would guide their actions, whether the sacrifice was food, an animal, or an item of value. It symbolized a mental release, a moment of rest from the heavy burden of survival. One fascinating aspect of Viking culture is how their approach to mental resilience affected their approach to death. The Vikings' understanding of death was not a final end, but rather a transition. To rest meant to embrace death as part of life's natural cycle. The Viking belief in an afterlife, whether in Valhalla or Helheim, was comforting because it reassured them that death was not something to fear. It was merely a passager way to rest in eternity after a life well lived. For the Vikings, accepting the inevitability of death allowed them to find peace in life. Their mental resilience was founded on this acceptance, enabling them to face both life and death with clarity and courage. This understanding of death as part of the cycle of rest is beautifully captured in their burial rituals. Viking burials often involved elaborate ceremonies, where the dead were honored and their journey to the afterlife was celebrated. The burial process itself, with its rituals and reflections, was a way to mentally and spiritually rest from the grief of loss. By honoring the dead, the Vikings also honored the idea that life and death were interwoven, and that the process of rest wasn't just for the living, it was for the deceased as well. The living could rest in the knowledge that their loved ones were now in the hands of the gods, At its core, mental rest for the Vikings was about balance. It was not about escaping the world, but finding ways to restore balance within it. Whether through social connections, spiritual reflection, or confronting the realities of life and death, the Vikings found ways to rest their minds and rejuvenate their spirits. In this sense, mental resilience and mental rest were two sides of the same coin. They worked together to allow the Vikings to endure their harsh world and emerge stronger on the other side. Mental rest wasn't a luxury for the Vikings. It was essential. It was the foundation of their resilience, allowing them to confront each challenge with determination and a sense of purpose. Today, as we face our own mental and emotional struggles, there is much to learn from the Vikings' approach. Mental rest is not something to be ignored or pushed aside. It's just as essential as physical rest, and it is something that requires attention, reflection, and, perhaps, a bit of communal support. By embracing the same resilience that the Vikings did, we too can find ways to rest and recover mentally, ensuring that we have the strength to face whatever challenges come our way. As we near the end of our exploration into the Vikings' approach to rest, it's time to examine the interwoven relationship between rest and preparation. This idea of rest wasn't solely about passive recovery, nor was it just about recharging for more battles or hard work. For the Vikings, rest was not a break from action. It was often an active part of their preparation for future endeavors. Whether it was preparing for the next raid, the next season's planting, or the challenges of the harsh winter, rest was always integrated into their strategy of survival and success. The Vikings understood that they couldn't always be in motion. The rhythm of their lives required periods of rest in order to maintain their strength and resilience. But rather than viewing rest as an interruption of their work, the Vikings saw it as an integral part of their preparation process. Rest wasn't a time for idle laziness. It was a strategic pause, a moment to refresh and recalibrate before facing the next challenge. One of the most significant ways rest and preparation worked hand in hand was through the preparation for raids and voyages. For the Vikings, these were not just battles, they were the means by which they expanded their territory, acquired wealth, and ensured their survival. But as much as they lived for the thrill of the raid, they also knew that the success of these ventures depended on how well they prepared. Rest played a huge role in this preparation. Imagine the scene. The warriors are gathering in the longhouse, discussing strategy, sharpening weapons, and preparing the ships for the journey ahead. But none of these tasks could be done if they were physically and mentally exhausted. In the days leading up to a raid, rest became a part of the preparation process. The warriors knew that their bodies and minds needed to be in top form to succeed. Even the leaders, who were often deeply involved in planning, understood that their mental clarity was crucial, and so they would find time to rest, recharge, and sleep, knowing that they couldn't rely on pure adrenaline to carry them through the battle. Even the sailors, who would embark on long and treacherous voyages across the seas, knew that rest was necessary for endurance. Imagine being out at sea for weeks, navigating unpredictable weather and battling exhaustion. The Viking ships, or longships, were marvels of engineering, designed for speed and maneuverability, but they were still grueling to sail. The mental and physical toll of these voyages meant that sailors had to find ways to rest, both physically and mentally. Whether it was taking short naps in between shifts or retreating to a quiet part of the ship to rest, the Vikings understood that their ability to rest was as important as their ability to sail. For the Vikings, rest wasn't just about preparing for the physical demands of a raid, it was also about preparing mentally. The anticipation of a raid could be a mentally taxing experience. Warriors would face the emotional weight of leaving their families behind, the fear of battle, and the pressure to succeed. Rest, during this time, would allow the Vikings to clear their minds, reflect on their purpose, and mentally prepare for what lay ahead. By taking moments of rest, they could calm their nerves, push aside distractions, and focus entirely on the task at hand. Preparation for winter also played a major role in the Vikings' understanding of rest. The brutal cold of the Scandinavian winter meant that survival required forethought and careful planning. Winter rest wasn't about being idle, it was about setting up the resources, shelters, and supplies needed to get through the dark, cold months. This preparation allowed the Vikings to enjoy a more restful winter because they had done the hard work in advance. The longhouses were stocked with preserved food, the animals were cared for, and the community was ready for the isolation that winter brought. This was a strategic rest period where they could focus more on maintaining community and mental health. Knowing that their material needs were taken care of, winter wasn't just a time for physical preparation. It was a time for spiritual rest and renewal. The Vikings took this time to pause and reflect on their spiritual journey. With less work to do outside, the long winter nights were a time for honoring the gods, making offerings, and re-establishing their spiritual connections. These acts of devotion were an integral part of their preparations, as they believed the gods had a hand in the success of their raids and battles. Their rest during the winter months wasn't only about recharging. Physically, it was about reaffirming their spiritual strength and reaffirming their purpose. Through rituals and prayers, they mentally and spiritually prepared themselves for the trials that awaited them when the weather turned favorable again. Another important aspect of preparation through rest was building resilience for the coming year. The Vikings were acutely aware of the cyclical nature of life. They knew that each year brought a new set of challenges, whether it was the unpredictability of weather, the necessity to acquire resources, or the need to defend their land. As such, rest was a way for them to recover from the previous year's struggles and to prepare themselves for what was ahead. Whether it was tending to their boats, preparing their fields, or gearing up for the challenges of combat, the time spent resting allowed them to rebuild strength and renew their sense of purpose. Rest through leisure was also part of the Viking preparation process. While much of their lives were devoted to hard labor, there were moments when they would step back from their work and engage in light, enjoyable activities. This might involve storytelling, music, or simply socializing with fellow community members. These moments of leisure gave them a mental break from the constant pressure of their environment, allowing them to relax and recharge. This wasn't just a break from work, it was a form of preparation for the mental challenges of the coming seasons. It gave them a chance to reflect, recharge, and enjoy the social bonds that were so vital to their well-being. For the Vikings, mental fortitude was as critical to their preparation as physical strength. They understood that to be truly effective, whether in battle, in farming, or in navigating the seas, they needed to have mental clarity and emotional resilience. The periods of rest that they took throughout the year allowed them to build this fortitude. The communal meals, the quiet moments of reflection, and the rituals they followed were not just about relaxing. They were part of a larger strategy of mental preparation. By resting and taking time for themselves, the Vikings were ensuring that they had the strength to face whatever challenges came their way. It is this balance between rest and preparation that made the Vikings such formidable individuals and a successful civilization. They understood that without proper rest, neither the body nor the mind could function at full capacity. By integrating rest into their preparation for battle, voyages, and winter, they were able to recharge, renew, and face the challenges of their world with strength, focus, and resilience. As we reflect on the Vikings' approach to rest, it's clear that rest wasn't a passive activity for them. It wasn't just about taking naps or sleeping at night. It was about integrating rest into their daily lives in a way that supported their ability to thrive. Their understanding of rest as part of their preparation for the challenges of life is something that can offer valuable lessons for us today. In a world where we often forget to rest until we burn out, the Vikings remind us that rest is just as important as work. It is the fuel that prepares us for whatever the future holds.